everybody, my name is Mechthild Wörsdörfer, and it's a great privilege to present the IEA's first ever global roadmap for the energy sector to achieve net zero emission by 2050 here at the Power Summit of Eurelectric. Let me start with a few words of context. As you all know, many governments and even companies have stepped up and set up objectives to reach net zero by 2050. The EU is one of the first continents to reach net zero by 2050, and the European Green Deal is certainly a best practice, an ambition others would like to copy. In view of the COP26 in Glasgow, there is still a lot to do to make that these global ambitions are also met by action. That's why we, as the International Energy Agency, have worked closely with COP26, and we have looked at all the net zero pledges in our IEA roadmap. 70% of the global GDP and CO2 emissions are covered by these net zero pledges, but only a few have done concrete steps or put it in law like the EU is doing right now. Let me start giving a little bit of a modeling technical context. If we compare the first global IEA roadmap net zero scenario with the work of IPCC, which has done a number of scenarios to reach 1.5 by 2050, which we are all aware is hugely ambitious. When we look and compare a couple of milestones in the different scenarios, you can see here, and let me just illustrate one or two things where the IEA is situated vis-à-vis the other IPCC scenarios. If you look, for example, at carbon dioxide removal technologies like BECCS or DACs, we have been using much less in our net zero emission scenario than the ones of the IPCC. Let's look at bioenergy. There is a phase-out of traditional use of biomass, which is currently the cause of around 2.5 million premature deaths, mainly in developing countries. Advanced bioenergy in our net zero scenario is around 100 exajoule of primary energy in 2050. We're also looking at hydrogen. We are well above the IPCC scenario when it comes to the development of hydrogen, of green hydrogen in particular, by 2050. This might be that the IPCC scenarios are now getting a little bit older, and we have taken into account all the hydrogen strategies and pledges like the EU and many of the member countries have done in 2020 and 2021. So, what is the main focus of the next decade, meaning the 2020s, from now till 2030, where we have to reduce by around 12 gigaton of CO2 emissions in the world to be on track for 1.5 degrees. And this is an opportunity now coming out of the crisis and in the recovery. So let me take 3 examples. The annual capacity additions of solar PV and wind industry has quadrupled over the past decade. So they need to quadruple again in the next decade from now till 2030. Wind and solar PV provide as much as 40% of electricity generation globally in 2030 from around 9% today. Denmark and Ireland, for example, produced at least 40% of electricity from wind and solar in 2020. Electric cars. Car sales has been around 5% of new sales last year in 2020. They need to reach 60% of total sales by 2035. There are no new sales of internal combustion engines cars globally by 2035 in our scenario. For now, Norway and Iceland have just passed 50% of electric car sales in 2020 and Sweden and Netherlands are around 25%. We all know that boosting energy efficiency is key. It's not only key for energy security, it's key also in terms of job creation and climate goals. So most efficiency measures are in industry, buildings, appliances, and transport, and they can be put into effect and scaled up very quickly. Energy efficiency are mainly front-loaded in our net zero scenario. But the energy intensity globally needs to fall by 4% per year in order to achieve the net zero pathway. In recent years, energy intensity has only fallen by around 2% per year globally. What do we need? How can we achieve this net zero? We need huge investments in clean energy transition. And we need to work on what happens in the money we spend. So we need to triple our investments from around $1 trillion, a little bit more, to $4 trillion by 2030. By 2030, annual investment in renewables in the electricity sector is around $1.3 trillion, more than the highest level ever spent on fossil fuel supply, like $1.2 trillion in 2014. Also, investments in clean energy infrastructure triples around 300 billion to around 900 billion in 2030. There's a small but crucial increase in investments also in low-emission fuels such as hydrogen, ammonia, synthetic fuels, and sustainable biofuels. Most of the increase in investment comes from the private sector, mobilized by public policies that create incentives, set appropriate regulatory frameworks, and reform energy taxes. However, direct governing financing is also needed to boost the development of new infrastructure projects like the EU is doing with 10E, and to accelerate innovation in technologies that are today in demonstration. This challenge is historic, but it would create an economic boost which could reach 0.4% of GDP global annually in the net zero scenario. So it's not only about economic growth, it's mainly about jobs. The changes in spending and investment radically shift the energy workforce. We have calculated that global energy employment is around 40 million people today. The net zero scenario would create around 14 million new jobs in electricity and low-carbon fuel sectors. But around 5 million jobs will be lost in fossil fuel, with over half in the coal mining sector, followed by oil and gas, particularly in upstream exploration. So we have to look at how in some regions people are affected by this change, and how can we eventually use skills like for coal mining to critical minerals mining, like for some extraction for technology like CCUS. We have also analyzed where these jobs could be. And as you can see here, we could gain a lot of jobs in a high-level medium sector in 2050 if we follow the pathway. But we would need a huge amount of training depending on the community, on the region. For example, the coal region in transition is one of the clear priority of the EU. Others can learn from it in order to help those regions which are dependent on fossil fuels and help the social and just transition there. As mentioned earlier, we basically have all the technology available in the market today to achieve the emission reductions required by 2030 to put the world on track to net zero emission. But a full transition to net zero emissions by 2050 will require more than that. It will require tackling emissions in sectors like long-distance transport and heavy industry. And we won't have all the technologies to decarbonize these sectors on the market. There are many technology options. You can see here they fall in the categories of electrification, hydrogen, and sustainable bioenergy. Let me just highlight one example: advanced battery designs that can provide a step change in energy density and open the possibility to electrify heavy-duty trucks, short-distance ships, and possibly even short flights. They are, however, at a prototype stage today. We also need to look at the energy security risks today. It has changed and it will change from what we are used to look at oil security and gas security, as the demand for oil and gas will drop significantly, and the increased diversity of the energy sources used in our scenario will certainly reduce some of those risks. We have said no new oil and natural gas fields are needed in our pathway. We have also looked at the substantial quantities which are required for the clean energy transition of critical minerals. The scale-up of wind, solar PV, and batteries all require large quantities of minerals like copper, cobalt, manganese, and various rare earth metals. We estimate that total demands for those minerals will grow almost sevenfold between now and 2050. Finally, there are also potential vulnerabilities which are linked to maintain a reliable, flexible, and secure electricity systems. In our scenario, electricity becomes the largest source of energy demand by 2050, and additional electricity needs come from producing hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels. At the same time, the share of solar PV and wind rises from around 9% to almost 70% in 2050. The result is that the need for electricity system flexibility quadruples by 2050. The sources of flexibility shift away from unabated fossil fuels to demand-side response, battery storage, and dispatchable low-emission sources such as hydropower, sustainable bioenergy, and others. Let me finish. When we look at the net zero 2050 pathway, we also have to look at the way and at the different milestones in order to reach that target in 3 decades. So a transition to net zero will come with many milestones, and in our IEA net zero roadmap, we have identified around 400 such milestones at global level. Of course, each country, the EU, each region has its own circumstances and will make its own plans for the transition to net zero. But we have identified a couple of broader milestones needed on the way to net zero by 2050. First, hydrogen is set to become an increasingly important part of our energy mix on the road to net zero emissions by 2050. Already through 2030, low-carbon hydrogen supplies need to scale up from next to none today to around 150 megatons in 2030, with a big increase in electrolyzer installation. Many European countries and also the EU have come up with hydrogen strategies are working in putting that in a framework to speed up and scale up hydrogen from now till 2030 and beyond. Second, it's also important to recognize that there is no shortage of technology options to decarbonize electricity generation. In our scenario, the sector is the first to achieve net zero emissions at a global level by 2040, and as early as 2035 overall in advanced economies like the EU or the US. And finally, as mentioned earlier already, renewables become the dominant source of electricity generation in our scenario. By 2050, almost 90% of total electricity generation are from renewables, and almost 70% from solar PV and wind power alone. This is a pathway. As I said in the beginning, the IEA has been looking globally how to reach net zero by 2050. This is a scenario, a pathway. There are more information in our report, and this is a basis for discussion in that crucial year of coming out of the pandemic, looking at the opportunities from stimulus packages, EU Generation Program and others, and make that happening, and there is an urgent need for action. Thank you very much for your attention.